So here we are on the fourth and last piece of the endocrine system lecture. We're going to talk about the pancreas, pineal gland, and then a little bit about the gonads because we're going to talk about those more later. Okay, so for the pancreas is going to be located right underneath the stomach. Kind of take the stomach, flap it up, it'll be right there, embedded in the mesentery there. And it is a mixed gland, as we've already seen. We talked about the pancreas when we talked about the digestive system. It secretes pancreatic juice, which has digestive enzymes in it. It also has some bicarbonate, that kind of stuff. So that would mean that that is part of the exocrine because it's secreting onto a surface. So even though it's inside, the small intestine would still be a surface because it is continuous with the outside. Okay, so it's an exocrine gland, and it is also an endocrine gland. Okay, so if you're looking at the tissue in the microscope, this is what it would look like. These are called the islets of Langerhans, sometimes learned as just islets or islets. If you want to say it like that, that's fine with me. And then all of these cells surrounding the outside here, whoopsies. These cells surrounding the outside here, these are called acinar cells. And those acinar cells, those are going to secrete and make the pancreatic juice. Okay, so those would be the exocrine function. And the islets or the islets, those create the endocrine function because they have two different cell types. You have alpha cells, and alpha cells secrete glucagon, and then beta cells, and beta cells secrete insulin. Okay, so the glucagon and the insulin, they are in an antagonistic loop, and both of them regulate blood glucose levels. Okay, so blood glucose levels. I want you to know which cells secrete what, and the interactions of those different hormones. Okay, so let's talk about what insulin does. What insulin does is decrease blood glucose levels. Now, some of us, that's just sort of where understanding stops, right? So we understand that insulin decreases the blood glucose levels, but where does the glucose go? The glucose goes into the cells. So the purpose of insulin is going to be secreted during the absorptive state when you've got high levels of glucose. And what it does is it allows the glucose to get into the cells so that you can do cellular respiration. Right, so it's not so much about decreasing the blood glucose levels. It's more about making sure that those glucose can get into the cells so that it can be used to create energy. That is the main point of the insulin. Okay, so here's how it works. Insulin is a water-soluble hormone, so the receptor for the insulin is going to be located on the surface of the cell. So here's the plasma membrane. It's going to be embedded in this little channel here, and it'll bind to the hormone, bind to the receptor. So the insulin will bind to the receptor, and that's going to use a second messenger to trigger a whole pathway, signaling pathway. And what that does is it causes a vesicle that is floating inside of the cytoplasm to go up to the surface and then fuse with the surface. And when it fuses with the surface, what that does is it actually inserts glucose channels into the surface of the cell. Okay, so those little glucose channels are sort of stored inside of the cell in the vesicles. With the presence of insulin, that's going to cause them to be inserted into the channel. And so because glucose is polar and a little bit on the bigger side, it requires these channels to get in. You can't get the glucose into the cells without a carrier protein, right? So now we need to insert those carrier proteins into the plasma membrane of the cell, and it'll insert them in, and that allows the glucose to come inside of the cell. And then that's how you get it to use it for cellular respiration. Okay? So I want you to understand the action of the glucose, action of the insulin, not just that it decreases blood glucose, but how it does it. It does it by inserting glucose channels into the plasma membrane so that the glucose can go into the cells for cellular respiration. Okay, glucagon. Glucagon opposes insulin. So what it does is it's going to increase blood glucose levels. And so glucagon is going to be secreted during the post-absorptive state. So when you eat the hungry state, right, the fasting state. And what it does is it's going to go to the liver as well as the skeletal muscles, and it's going to cause the breakdown of the glycogen, which is the storage molecule where all of the glucoses are all hooked together. It'll take the glycogen and then break it apart to release the glucose into the blood supply. And this helps maintain a fairly consistent blood glucose levels, which is very important because the brain is primarily run on glucose. It doesn't use lipid metabolism very well. So it requires a very consistent supply of glucose so that your brain can continue to work properly. Okay, so you have the increase in blood glucose because it's released from the glycogen. So there's a lot of G words here, so be careful. Sometimes people get the G words mixed up with each other. So remember that glycogen, that is the complex carbohydrate where the glucose molecules are stored, and glucagon is the hormone that causes the digestion of the glycogen. So careful. A lot of G words there. Okay, so now they create an antagonistic loop with each other. Okay, so they allow you to not have to eat continuously. They allow you to eat and then not eat for a little while still maintaining a fairly consistent blood glucose levels. And so when you haven't eaten for a little while, so during the post-absorptive state, that is going to cause the secretion of the glucagon. So this would be an example of humoral stimulation because you don't require neural or endocrine input in order to secrete that glucagon. It's just going to be secreted based on the change in glucose levels. So that'll secrete the glucagon here. And when the secretion of the glucagon, that'll go to the liver and the skeletal muscles and cause the glycogen to be digested, and that will release into the blood, therefore increasing the blood glucose. When you've eaten, so during the absorptive state, you have high levels of glucose because you've just digested a bunch of stuff. That will then cause the secretion, that high levels of glucose itself will act as the stimulation to secrete the insulin from the pancreas. The insulin then goes to the body cells. It causes them to insert those glucose protein channels into the surface. That allows the glucose to go into the cells, thereby decreasing the blood glucose levels back down because the cells are going to use that glucose for their metabolism to create energy, ATP. Okay, so these would be an antagonistic effectors because insulin decreases blood glucose levels, whereas glucagon increases blood glucose levels. So they work against each other. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about diabetes. So diabetes there's two different types of diabetes. You have type 1 diabetes, which used to be called early onset diabetes. Then you have type 2 diabetes, which used to be called late onset diabetes. And what this is for type 1 diabetes, they are unable to, or they have reduced or sometimes are unable to produce the insulin. And if you can't produce the insulin, that makes it more difficult for the glucose to get into the cells. And so that's in a form of autoimmunity. And so usually it happens around, like around 10-ish. And the immune system attacks the beta cells, preventing them from producing the insulin. You can't have the insulin, which means you can't get the blood into it. So that used to be, really, really serious, and you didn't survive if you had this. But nowadays you can just inject insulin and you're generally fine. Now, type 2. Type 2 is called late onset because what happens is if you have consistently high levels of blood glucose, either from diet, lack of exercise, or even from very chronic stress because of the cortisol levels, you can develop these insensitivities where the insulin is still being produced. You still have, normal or sometimes even elevated levels of insulin, but when the insulin binds to its receptor, you're not getting the signaling pathway, because the response that cells take to a hormone is going to be concentration dependent, sort of like the Goldilocks theory, right? You need just the right amount. If you have too much, that's going to interfere with the signaling pathway, which means that you're not going to get the response. You don't get those insertions of the glucose transport channels, and that makes it so that you can't get the glucose into the cells. Okay, so they're still producing insulin, it's just not working. Okay, so in either case, they can have the similar types of effects. And what happened, the biggest problem here is not the high blood glucose levels. Remember, that's sort of secondary, really. The biggest problem is you're not getting the glucose into the cells. The cells can't make their ATP with it, and that's going to kill the cells. Okay, so you can have you can have death of the cells, especially in the extremities where it's even harder to get at. And this also can cause a bunch of other kind of complications, because what can happen is you can actually damage the capillaries themselves, so that the capillary walls are also being damaged by their inability to take up the glucose. And so that can make them stiff. And when they're stiff, that can make high blood pressure, also known as hypertension, much worse. And so that can lead to things like heart attacks and strokes. You can also damage the capillaries in the eyes if you have too high a blood pressure. You can also damage the capillaries in the nephrons, which are in the kidneys. So you can have renal problems there. You can have problems with the pressure in the eyeball. So you have this huge body-wide problems that can sort of compound with each other to make it worse and worse. Okay, so make sure that you stay on top of it. Diabetes is not something you want to let go too far. Okay, a couple of miscellaneous glands, and then we'll be done. Okay, first one is the pineal gland. So if you're looking at the brain here, here's the thalamus. Looks like a big eye to me. So there's the thalamus. If you go posterior to the thalamus, you've got this little circular gland. That is the pineal gland, and the function of the pineal gland is to control sort of life cycle, how do I say this? Sort of timing throughout the day. So when you're awake and when you're sleeping, I forgot what that's called. Anyways, timing throughout the day, there you go. And because the way it does that is it secretes a hormone called melatonin, which you may have heard of before. So here's how it works. When you have light, and especially blue light, they've recently discovered, when you have light, that's going to be seen through the optic nerve. It'll travel through, and it actually inhibits the pineal gland. So light inhibits the production of melatonin. When it starts getting dark, you have less light coming into the pineal gland. Less inhibition is the same as stimulation, and so that's going to stimulate the pineal gland to increase the levels of melatonin that are produced. And melatonin is going to cause you to get really sleepy, but it also helps to regulate your sleep cycles, so that you don't just sleep, it just doesn't make you fall asleep, but it also helps you stay asleep and sleep through the proper cycles as you go through the sleep. And so that's why that's why they tell you not to take your phones to bed, because light, especially blue light, which is what cell phones produce, they can increase that light, and they cause the inhibition of the melatonin, so your body doesn't make as much melatonin, so that even if you're able to fall asleep, you'll have a poor quality of sleep, because you don't have that melatonin to regulate the sleep cycle. Okay, so it's really important for not just falling asleep. Some of us are like, well, I fall asleep fine, but do you stay asleep properly, and do you feel rested when you get up? If not, you might want to think about dimming the lights, not taking your phone to bed, you not having your screens right in front of you. You'll get a better quality of sleep. Okay, sex hormones. for the gonads, I don't want to talk about them too much yet because we're going to have a whole lecture on reproduction, but I do want to mention that the ovaries, they're going to produce estrogens and progesterone, and those are going to help affect female sexual characteristics. They also regulate the ovarian cycle. And then the testes will produce testosterone, and testosterone is the primary and secondary characteristics. It also stimulates sperm production. I did also want to mention that you do produce testosterone a little bit in females, but just not nearly the same levels. Okay, and the placenta. The placenta is this organ right here, and it is found at birth, not at birth, when the fetus embeds itself, embryo, that's the word. When the embryo embeds itself, what it does is that part of it is called the chorionic, and the chorionic can develop into the placenta. And the primary function of the placenta is to bring oxygen and nutrients and antibodies to the fetus to, keep it alive. But it also has an endocrine function because it can produce estrogens and progesterone, and the function of those estrogens and progesterone is to maintain the pregnancy and pretty much stop the female cycle, okay, so that you don't have the menstruation phase because you're just maintaining the pregnancy. Okay, so it actually does produce its own set of hormones. Okay, so why is that pancreas called the mixed gland? It's because it has both endocrine and exocrine functions. Which hormones are produced by the pancreas? Those would be the insulin and the glucagon, so the insulin will be secreted by the beta cells, the glucagon will be secreted by the alpha cells, and they both regulate the levels of glucose in the body. Okay, have a good day.